All right, so Thomas Hobbes, right? Everyone knows him for Leviathan, like that's the book on political order. But get this, Hobbes actually thought he was going to be groundbreaking in two completely different fields. Not just political philosophy, which he called natural justice, but also optics. Yeah, optics. He really thought he was laying the groundwork for both. At first, he actually got some attention for his work on optics, but once Leviathan came out, that kind of all went away. So it makes you wonder, why even bother looking at these, like, failed attempts, right?
What's so interesting is that when you look beyond just Leviathan, you start to get a much clearer picture of Hobbes's overall intellectual ambition, like how he wanted to act as a philosopher in a really comprehensive sense. And I think for you, the listener, wanting to really grasp these big ideas but efficiently, this deep dive isn't just about rehashing, the social contract and all that. We're going deeper, uncovering how Hobbes approached understanding the world, like his fundamental way of thinking, which he applied, across all these different areas of study.
I see what you mean. It's like we're not just looking at the specific conclusions he came to, but the process, the method he used to get there.
Exactly. Like, how did he go about trying to figure things out? What did he think counted as real knowledge? And that's, I think, really valuable for anyone today who's interested in, well, knowledge itself, right?
For sure. So what's the game plan for this deep dive? Where are we headed with this?
So we're going to explore Hobbes's philosophy of science. So we're talking about like his core beliefs about what constitutes actual knowledge. You might be surprised to hear this, but he was really into math, and we'll get into why that was. And of course, you can't talk about Hobbes without mentioning his clashes with like the emerging experimental science of his time, represented by guys like Robert Boyle and the Royal Society. Ultimately, though, I think all of this feeds into his like grand vision for a scientific approach to civil philosophy. And to help us make sense of all this, we're going to be relying on some great insights from, the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's entry on Hobbes' philosophy of science, which is a really good starting point for anyone who wants to go deeper.
Okay, so we've got our roadmap and a good source to guide us. Let's start with the basics then. Hobbes was like a hardcore materialist, right? Everything is just like stuff, matter, in motion.
Absolutely. That's the foundation of everything for him. And from this, he kind of explained away things like color and taste, what he called secondary qualities, as basically, motions that come from objects and then affect our senses, which then lead to ideas in our minds.
So like if I see a red apple.
The redness itself for Hobbes isn't like a real property of the apple. It's more like the result of certain motions interacting with your eyes and, your brain. It's kind of mind-blowing when you think about it.
It is, it is. So that's his materialist side. But then there's also this empiricist side to Hobbes, right? Like he believed all our ideas come from sensory experience.
That's right. But here's the thing that makes Hobbes so interesting, especially in terms of how he wanted to act as a philosopher. He didn't think we should just blindly trust whatever our senses tell us. He was much more careful, more nuanced than that.
That's interesting. So how do we know anything for sure then if we can't trust our senses?
Well, that's a huge question, right? How do we know anything at all? Hobbes recognized that our access to reality, that how things really are, is kind of indirect. He even said, we compute nothing but our phantasms or ideas, meaning we're not experiencing the world directly, we're experiencing our ideas of the world. It's like there's this layer of interpretation happening all the time.
And that, I guess, creates a couple of like pretty big worries. Like, first of all, if all we know are our ideas, how do we know those ideas even resemble, like, the actual things out there in the world? How do we know they're accurate representations?
Exactly. That's a spot-on question. And Hobbes himself was wrestling with this. He used examples like, a rainbow or looking at your reflection in a lake. The colors in the rainbow or your image in the water, they seem to be there, right? But you and I both know that the real you isn't actually standing in the lake and the rainbow isn't this solid arch of colors just hanging in the sky.
Yeah, it's an optical illusion, basically.
Right. And Hobbes used those kinds of everyday examples to make this point. Qualities like color and shape as we see them, those aren't necessarily how things really are out there in the world. They're more about how we experience those things.
Okay, I'm starting to see where he's coming from. So that's one problem. What was the other big worry he had about, trying to act as a philosopher and understand the world?
Well, the second big one was this. How can we know the causes of things that happen in nature? I mean, think about it. We humans didn't make the natural world. We didn't design it like an architect designs a building.
Yeah, true. We just kind of like observe things happening.
Right, exactly. We see things happen in a sequence, Like we see lightning, then we hear thunder, but we don't directly perceive that causal link, that actual mechanism that connects those two events.
So for Hobbes, because we didn't create nature, we can never really know the actual causes of natural things. We can only know, like, possible causes.
That's a great way to summarize it. And this leads us to how Hobbes defines scientific knowledge. He used this term scientia. And for him, scientia, true knowledge, meant knowing the actual cause of something. He used this Greek phrase, toidity, which basically means the why, like the deepest, most fundamental why. Not just like that something happens, but why it happens.
So that's a pretty high bar for knowledge, right? Like knowing the why behind everything.
Oh, yeah, for sure. And this is where Hobbes makes a really surprising and honestly kind of radical claim. And I think it's central to how he viewed himself as a philosopher,
Yeah.
trying to establish real, true sciences. He said that the only fields where humans do make the objects of study and therefore can achieve this level of scientific knowledge are geometry, because we
Right.
actually draw the figures ourselves,
Yeah.
and civil philosophy, because we create the commonwealth through the social contract.
Well, hold on. So he's saying that physics, biology, chemistry, like all these natural sciences, those aren't real sciences in the same way that math and political theory are.
That's exactly what he's saying. It's a bold statement, right? And this is where things get even more interesting because it leads us to how Hobbes thought we could still try to understand the natural world, even if we can't have this complete, absolute knowledge of it. And this is where math, especially geometry, becomes really, really important for him.
Okay, so how does math fit into all of this?
Well, there's been a lot of debate among, Hobbes scholars about how all the different parts of his philosophy hang together. Like, is it all one big, perfectly unified system where everything logically flows from a few basic principles? Or is it more like a bunch of, related but separate ideas?
And I think the current thinking is that it's maybe somewhere in between, right? This thing called the mixed mathematics view.
You got it. The mixed mathematics view. And this view says that Hobbes did see connections between different areas of knowledge, but not always in a super strict, deductive way. It's more like he was borrowing principles and ideas from math, particularly geometry, to help explain stuff in the natural world. And he was really careful about this. He actually cited his sources, where he got these principles from.
So it's like math gives him this underlying structure, this logic that he could then try to apply to nature, even if we can't directly observe those deep causes.
That's a great way to put it. Hobbes made this distinction between scientia, which is that true knowledge of causes, the deep why, and cognitio, which is the knowledge we get from our senses, just observing that something happens.
Scientia is like knowing why the cake is delicious, and cognitio is like just knowing that it is delicious.
Exactly. Perfect analogy. And Hobbes said that what he called true physics, or vera physica, had to be a combination of both. Geometry, with its ideas about quantity and space and motion, provides the causal why, and our experience confirms that something actually happens.
So it's like you need both the theory and the observation.
You need both. And there's a great example of this in De Corpore. Hobbes is explaining how sensation works, and he starts by saying, look, we all know from experience that our senses aren't always reliable. They change. They're not always accurate.
Right. Like sometimes I think I hear something, but then it turns out it was nothing.
Exactly. So he's acknowledging the role of experience, of observation. But then, to explain why sensation happens in the way it does, how those motions out in the world lead to our inner experiences, he uses these geometrical principles about how motion is transferred from one thing to another. He's combining what we observe with this kind of certainty that comes from math. And that, I think, is a great example of how he's acting as a philosopher of nature.
And I bet this emphasis on reason and math, that probably didn't go over too well with those early scientists who are all about experimentation, like Boyle and the Royal Society.
Oh, you're so right. That's a really important point. And their famous disagreement about Boyle's air pump experiments perfectly illustrates this clash between these two different ways of understanding the world. Now, to be fair, both Hobbes and Boyle agreed on the basic idea that everything is made of matter in motion. That was their common ground. But where they really differed was on stuff like, well, what are the laws of nature? And where do they come from? Boyle and a lot of the Royal Society, they saw the laws of nature as being established by God. Divine laws, basically.
And Hobbes, with his focus on reason.
Hobbes had a very different take. He thought his own fundamental principles of motion were what he called a priori. That means there are truths that we can figure out just by thinking really carefully, by doing these thought experiments before we even do any actual physical experiments.
Mhm.
And that comes from, well, basically a form of the principle of sufficient reason.
So he didn't need to go out and do experiments to figure these things out. He could just arrive at them through like pure thought just by acting as a philosopher thinking it through.
That's right. And this is why he was so skeptical of the idea that experiments alone could reveal the true causes of things in nature. Because we didn't make nature, we can't directly access those hidden causes. And so for Hobbes, you could always come up with different possible explanations for why something happens, even if you see it happen over and over again in a lab.
So just because you see something repeated, it doesn't mean you know the real why behind it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You got it. And Hobbes thought that before you even start doing experiments, you need to have a solid foundation in what he called first philosophy, which is like, metaphysics and epistemology, and especially geometry. He even said you need the noblest part of geometry to really understand motion. That's how important math was to him.
It sounds like he was much more of an armchair philosopher compared to the Royal Society, which was all about collaboration and getting your hands dirty with experiments.
That's a good way to put it. He really valued individual intellectual clarity, that ability to reason things through for yourself over just collecting data through experiments. But, and this is important, Hobbes didn't completely reject the idea of experience. He said that natural and civil history, which is basically careful observation, are important for establishing that something happens.
So, like, you need to know that the phenomenon exists before you can even start to explain it.
Right. But simply observing something, even if you do it a million times, that won't tell you the underlying cause for him.
I see. So any examples from his back and forth with Boyle that really highlight this difference in their approaches to acting as philosophers trying to understand the world?
Oh, definitely. In his book, Dialogus Physicus, Hobbes directly takes on Boyle's famous experiment with the bladder and the air pump. Remember that one?
Vaguely. Refresh my memory.
Okay, so Boyle puts this, inflated bladder inside his air pump. And when he pumps the air out, the bladder, kind of collapses. And Boyle says, see, this proves that the air has weight. It has this natural gravity that pushes down on things. Now, in the Dialogus Physicus, the character speaking for Hobbes, he doesn't disagree that the bladder collapsed. He accepts the observation. But he completely rejects Boyle's explanation for why it collapsed. He says, nope, it's not because of the air's weight. It's because of something else. And he goes on to offer his own explanation based on his ideas about motion and what he calls fermentation, which is this whole other concept he developed in his book, De Corpore.
So even though they're observing the same thing, they come up with completely different explanations for it.
Exactly. And that's because they have these, very different underlying philosophies.
I'm starting to see how all of this connects to his ideas about what natural philosophy is even for. It wasn't just about, describing what happens through experiments. It was about trying to understand the why, the possible causes, and ultimately, I guess, using that knowledge to improve human life.
That's a really crucial point. Hobbes saw a practical purpose to natural philosophy. It wasn't just some abstract intellectual exercise. He talked about how we have these trains of thought, some that are just wandering around aimlessly, and others that are directed towards a specific goal. And he gives this funny example about a conversation that starts talking about the English Civil War and then randomly shifts to talking about how much a Roman penny used to cost. Just to illustrate that even in those seemingly random thoughts, there's this underlying connection between ideas.
So even when our minds are wandering, there's still some kind of logic or order to it.
That was his thinking. But the real valuable trains of thought for Hobbes were the guided ones, where we're actively trying to figure out how to achieve something to solve a problem. And that means trying to understand the causes of things, even if we can only know, possible causes, not the absolute definitive cause.
Which brings us back to the limits of what we can know, right?
Exactly. And this is where Hobbes introduces this idea of prudence, which is basically the ability to reason and make judgments based on our past experience and the patterns we've observed. Like a really experienced cook can probably look at a new recipe and have a good idea of how it's going to turn out based on their knowledge of ingredients and cooking methods.
So prudence is like learning from experience, from trial and error.
Yeah, it's a good way to think about it. But Hobbes knew that this kind of reasoning, this prudence, had its limits. It relies on the assumption that the future will be like the past. But what happens when you encounter a situation you've never seen before? Or what if you miss some tiny detail that ends up changing everything?
So prudence can be helpful, but it's not foolproof.
Not at all. Hobbes even said, and I love this quote, he said, "The omission of every little circumstance altering the effect frustrateth the expectation of the most prudent." Basically, even the smartest, most careful person can get things wrong if they overlook some tiny detail. And this is one of the main reasons why Hobbes, even though he saw the value in experience, didn't fully buy into the whole experimental philosophy thing. Because for him, prudence, which is based on just seeing patterns, it's not the same as science yet.
Because ultimately, we're not the ones who made nature, so we can never fully know the real why behind things just by observing them.
That's the heart of it. True knowledge, scientia, for Hobbes, gives you a kind of power. Because, I mean, you understand how to create something, to make it, like in geometry, right? You understand the principles, so you can draw any shape you want.
So it's like active knowledge, not just passive observation.
Yeah, exactly. And he pointed to things like, clocks and maps. Those are practical inventions, right? But they're based on this deep understanding of geometry and math. And he even talked about, like, military fortifications, those big walls and stuff they used to build to protect cities. He said, yeah, some clever engineer might get the credit for designing those fortifications. But the reason they actually work, the underlying knowledge, comes from geometry.
So the engineer is like the midwife delivering the baby, but geometry is the mother.
That's exactly how he put it. He said,
Yeah.
the midwife passes with the vulgar for the mother. So it's this idea that the real knowledge, the source of the invention, is often hidden, it's not always obvious. And that's why his mixed mathematics approach to natural philosophy was so important to him. It was his way of trying to bridge this gap between just observing stuff and truly understanding the underlying causes. It's like he was trying to find a way to get to that why by combining the best of both worlds, the insights from experience and the certainty of math.
He was trying to find a way to act as a philosopher of the natural world. So how did all of this play out in his political philosophy? I mean, he was pretty confident in his own contributions, even comparing himself to, like, Copernicus and Galileo.
Oh, absolutely. He was not shy about claiming his place in history. And in his book, De Civ, he basically says, look, a truly scientific approach to civil philosophy, that starts right here with me. Like, he was drawing a line in the sand.
And he was pretty critical of all the political thought that came before him, right?
Oh, yeah, he was dismissive of a lot of it. He thought the sophists, they were all about just winning arguments, not finding truth. And he thought Christian theologians were basically just mixing up scripture with Aristotle. And that wasn't a real science for him. For Hobbes to act as a philosopher in the realm of politics, to create a real science of civil philosophy, you had to follow his rules. It had to be a real science, meaning we humans had to be the ones creating the object of study, which in this case is the Commonwealth. And it had to have real demonstrations based on clear definitions and logical reasoning.
Sounds like a pretty ambitious goal.
It was. And it's led to a lot of discussion among scholars about what exactly he meant by demonstration. Especially when you look at Leviathan and his famous laws of nature. Some scholars, they think Hobbes' definition of a law of nature is like an axiom in geometry, like one of those starting points that you can't really prove but just have to accept. And they say that all the other laws he talks about are basically derived from that first definition, just like theorems are derived from axioms in geometry.
So it's like he's trying to build a system of political thought that's as logically rigorous as Euclidean geometry.
That's the idea. But there's a problem. Hobbes himself actually criticized some aspects of Euclidean geometry. He said that the definitions don't always tell you how things are made, like what their causes are. And he even said that axioms themselves need to be demonstrated somehow. So if he didn't fully buy into the Euclidean model, how else did he think about demonstration in his political philosophy?
Good question. And I think that's where this other idea comes in, this maker's knowledge view, right?
Exactly. Remember how Hobbes said a good definition should explain how something is made, like a line is made by moving a point? Well, this maker's knowledge view says that's what he was doing with the laws of nature in Leviathan. He wasn't just laying down these abstract rules, he was giving us instructions for how to make a peaceful society, how to build a commonwealth.
So by following those laws, we're essentially creating peace and order in the same way that a geometer creates a line by moving a point.
That's the analogy. And Hobbes himself often talked about demonstration as this kind of like building up process, a showing of how a complex thing is made from simpler parts. So you could say that his whole civil philosophy is like a big demonstration. He starts with the state of nature in Leviathan, which is basically chaos. And then he shows us how, step by step, by following the laws of nature, we can construct a stable commonwealth. It's like a blueprint for building a society.
So we've covered a lot of ground here. Just to recap, Hobbes wasn't just a political philosopher. He had this whole interconnected way of thinking about knowledge and science. He was an empiricist, but not a naive one. He had this high standard for what counted as real knowledge, this emphasis on understanding the why. And his mixed mathematics approach was his attempt to bring that kind of rigor to our understanding of the natural world, which, by the way, put him at odds with some of the biggest scientific minds of his time.
And it all culminates in his ambitious attempt to create this, scientific approach to political philosophy based on this idea of making the Commonwealth. It's a really unique and challenging vision, but I think there's a lot we can still learn from it, even today.
I completely agree. And I think what's especially relevant for the listener is how Hobbes's ideas force us to really think about what we mean by knowledge in the first place. We tend to, equate science with experiments and data. But Hobbes reminds us that there's this whole other side to it. Reasoning, logic, thinking things through. And that's just as important, maybe even more important, for truly understanding the world around us, whether it's the natural world or the social world.
That's a great takeaway, and I think it leads to this question. If Hobbes is right, and true knowledge comes from making, from understanding how to construct things, does that mean we can only ever fully understand the things that we ourselves create, like scientific theories or societies or, even works of art? What about the things we don't create? Can we ever really know them deeply?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it makes me think about, in today's world, we're so focused on data and statistics, on finding correlations between things. But are we sometimes missing the bigger picture, the deeper why behind those correlations?
It's something to think about for sure. We're all about big data these days. But maybe we need a bit more of that Hobbesian emphasis on the why, on trying to understand the causes behind the patterns we see.
I think that's a great place to leave it. If you're listening, I encourage you to go back and revisit Hobbes. Don't just think of him as the Leviathan guy. He was so much more than that. He was a philosopher who was wrestling with some of the most fundamental questions about knowledge and science. And his ideas are still incredibly relevant, even centuries later. So dive in, explore, and see what you discover. You might be surprised at how much his ideas resonate with the challenges we're facing today.